I felt it was important that it be a dialogue that was firmly anchored in the non-Indigenous community. The series is designed to initially, though certainly not exclusively, address this community. If reconciliation is to become real, then we, the non-Indigenous, must carry our share of the responsibility, which means that there is considerable hard work that falls upon our shoulders. One of the ways that we can begin this work is by re-educating ourselves about the legacy of colonialism and the truth of the residential schools and the generational impact that this has had on the original peoples of these lands. No one truly knows what reconciliation is or what it can look like. Edward Abbey, possibly one of America's greatest but crustiest environmentalists, said that sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. When Senator Sinclair wrote up his commission report on the impact of the residential school experience in Canada, he included 94 calls to action. During his recent visit to Brantford, he explained that he and the other commissioners carefully chose the term calls to action as opposed to recommendations. They recognized that without real action on all our part, reconciliation would only be an illusion, an unrealized dream. We can start by giving recognition to the fact that the lands upon which we live, work, and stand are the traditional territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I would like to acknowledge and thank these people for their being the original caretakers of these lands. And I would also like to acknowledge the treaties that initially bound our communities together, but due to pervasive colonial thought, have been largely forgotten. But we can do more than just recognize these traditional territories and treaties. This evening, let each of us use our will to create a space within our own soul that is open and receptive to the truths of our shared histories. Let us remove the filters through which we hear the words of the other, which often alter what the other is truly communicating. Let us be open to understanding the enduring generational damage that resulted from our inability and unwillingness to fully recognize and respect the Indigenous knowledge and spirit of the original inhabitants of these lands.
The idea of the Friends and Neighbors group came from two inspirations. One was the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by Justice Sinclair and his decision to come and speak in Brantford. And the second was the statement by the Woodland Cultural Centre on their website about the building that housed the residential school that operated for so many years. And it was a statement saying they wanted to preserve it and use it to preserve the evidence and to continue the stories. On that website, there was an appeal to friends and neighbors, we need your support. And that's the challenge of Justice Sinclair, to have all Canadians think about something they could do towards reconciliation. And the challenge from the Woodland Cultural Centre led to a group of citizens in Brantford responding by forming the group, Friends and Neighbors of the Woodland Cultural Centre. I would like to call upon Chief David Hill to give a few remarks and to introduce the Lieutenant Governor as our first speaker.
Sabo, welcome everybody. So glad to be here. Had a busy day, but I didn't want to miss tonight to be here to introduce Her Honor, my good friend. And I've been asked to speak a little bit about the Save the Evidence campaign before I do the introduction. And I just want to say, we all know about the residential schools and the whole dark history of the residential schools, and we all know there's one located here in the city. It's called the Mohawk Institute. We in the community called it the Mush Hole. Many of you who are from the community may know why. It's because of the mush that was made there and fed to the kids in there every day, sometimes 3 times a day. That's one of the oldest schools, and it's 150 years old. It's been operating for 150 years. I think some have burned down and others have been built. Nevertheless, it is an old building. And the Woodland Cultural Centre and their staff under Janice's leadership have been looking after this building and came to our council because it is considered an asset of Six Nations and said, what do we do with the building? You know, the roof is leaking, it needs repair, it needs to be refurbished. What do we do with it? Do we tear it down or do we repair it? So we tasked them to go and have community meetings at Six Nations and to ask our community members, what do we want to do with this building? And particularly asked some of the residential school survivors who are still alive and who are still in our community. So they did that, they took their time and they did that, and they came back and they said, we want to save it. So hence began the Save the Evidence campaign. They said, we need to save that school as evidence of what happened to our young people in this country that was done to them by the churches and the government that were running those residential schools all across the country. And we want to remind people and we want to make sure that it never ever happens again. So we called it the Save the Evidence campaign. And the elected council kicked the campaign off by donating $220,000 towards the repair of the roof. And we put the challenge out there. I think that was in January 2015. And we put the challenge out there for people to match so that we could raise the money for it. And I'm pleased to say that the first ones to match it were the City of Brantford and the Rotary Club. The City of Brantford gave us $220,000. The Rotary clubs in Brantford also gave money. And I'm also happy that the Friends and Neighbors of Save the Evidence campaign was formed, and their group is what are organizing these events tonight. They were also doing their own fundraising, and I want to thank Dave, Rob, and Mary Lou for all the fine work that they've done. I think I went to one of your meetings. And so that began the campaign. So we put the call out there to firstly, replace the roof, which was going to cost $1 million. Then we want to refurbish the inside. And eventually we wanted to make it an interpretive center. And last September, I think it was last September, we were having the 230th anniversary of Her Majesty's Royal Chapel of the Mohawks. In her honor, Elizabeth Dowdeswell was coming. She was going to be there. I happened to see her at an event prior to that, and I said, would you like to have a private tour of the residential school, to which she agreed. So we did that, and we toured the school, and then we went to the chapel, and many months later, I think I asked the Premier, Kathleen Wynne, would you like a private tour? And she agreed. She made a special trip down here and took a private tour. But after the Lieutenant Governor was here, I know that she really took this issue to heart, because she's done a tremendous amount of work on the residential school and making people more aware of what happened during those residential schools. I know that she hosted the exhibit of the legacy that was held in your chambers at Queen's Park. People were invited in to see that. But even further to that, I'm not sure if the Premier was involved in this, but her staff and her were involved in organizing the event here on June 21st of this past year, which is Solidarity Day for us. We call it Solidarity Day, some people call it Aboriginal Day. But to us at Six Nations, it's Solidarity Day because we all come together. And her honor and her staff organized an event here to bring in a number of highly influential people to support the Save the Evidence campaign. And included in that was Governor General David Johnson and his wife, and members of the Prince's Charities, which is the Prince Charles's charities. They were all here. They were all busted. They were all given tours of that residential school. And they all got to hear the stories of some of those kids that lived in that residential school. And I think Her Honor will also heard those stories and will attest that some of them were pretty horrific of what those kids had to suffer. So we're truly grateful to her for her passion and her commitment to this issue and for the assistance she's extended to us. And I'm pleased to say that on May 30th, I was in Queen's Park when Premier Kathleen Wynne stood up and made the announcement of the statement of journey, and she made an apology for Ontario's role in the residential school system and committed dollars to help the Save the Evidence campaign, particularly for the Mohawk Institute. So now we are working on the roof. It has to be done by the end of March because you know how the government works. It's got to be done in this fiscal year. So we're working on that and we're moving forward with the other issues. And I think it's so important, and I just want to mention, before I introduce Her Honor, a little bit about the Truth and Reconciliation. Because we also have our residential school survivors who are working on their own project. And this is part of their healing process. They are trying to build a memorial park around the gardens, around the grounds of the Mohawk Institute, and they are raising their own money. And I'm working with them, and in fact, I just have to tell another story. I just got back from Toronto and I ran into a friend of mine I hadn't seen for about 40 years. And I used to work with her a long time ago. And she sat and told me today that she was in the residential schools and that she was assaulted every Friday night. And I never knew that, and I spent days working with this lady. And she told me when she was younger, when we were friends, she would never talk about it. But now they're talking about it. They're coming forward and they're telling the truth, and it's part of their healing process. And we got to admire the courage and the determination that they have to do that. So they went out and they told the truth. They had that courage to go tell the truth. Now it's up to us to make sure that there's reconciliation. And it's up to each one of us to look inside ourselves and define in our own minds, what does reconciliation mean to me, and what can I do to ensure that there is reconciliation? I do a lot of speaking engagements and everybody's asking, but you have to look inside. You know, you have to look at the history. To build for the future, we have to learn from the past and what happened. And I think the Save the Evidence campaign of our residential school is one step towards doing that. So that's just a quick synopsis, I guess, of the Save the Evidence tour. Prior to her appointment as the Lieutenant Governor, she served as President and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies and has had a number of successful leadership roles in public policy, the energy industry, education, and the public service. She has also held several high-ranking positions at the United Nations, including Under Secretary General. Her honor has been honored on many occasions for her public service, both in Canada and globally. And in 2012, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada and a Fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our special guest tonight, and my good friend, her honor, the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdeswell.
Thank you very much, Chief Hill, President Blau, Mr. Rossborough, and Mr. Newman, and friends and neighbors. It's an absolute delight to be here. Sego, bonjour, good evening. As we assemble here on this traditional territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and the Mississaugas of the New Credit, let us together honor the ancient and enduring history of First Peoples in Canada. And as always, it's such a privilege to be on Six Nations land and to be with Chief Ava Hill and others of the community. Thank you for that. Thank you also to Wilfrid Laurier University. I have, that may also be why I'm wearing purple. Okay. I've had the good fortune to spend some time both in Waterloo and here in Brantford, seeing the campuses and talking to students. So it's been a day of a privilege and a day of insight, and I very much appreciate the warm welcome that I've received once again. But tonight, in my few words, let me say it's a privilege to be with you for this very first lecture in this series on reconciliation. This theme is very meaningful to me, both personally and certainly in my role as Lieutenant Governor and representative of the Crown in Ontario. You know, as Lieutenant Governor, I have the opportunity to meet people from across this land, to celebrate with them those people and those places and events in which they take pride, and to understand better what their hopes and dreams and challenges are. I traveled throughout this great province, meeting as many people as possible where they live, where they work and play, and listen to and share their stories. And I do so not only because I find the stories to be instructive and educational, but because I believe that on a more theoretical level, perhaps, that the stories of people can actually represent the story of a people. Stories clearly give identity and foster belonging. As novelist Thomas King put it, if we change the stories we live by, quite possibly we change our lives. And so by sharing stories, we draw closer to each other, become more concerned about each other, and strengthen our civic bonds. And it is in fact through stories that we educate ourselves. And education is in fact, I believe, the first step to reconciliation. As Lieutenant Governor, I intend to do all that I can within my scope of powers to encourage a culture of reconciliation in Ontario. And I must say that during my visits to so many communities around this province, to places such as the Mohawk Institute, the Royal Chapel here in Brantford, I've had the profound privilege of meeting Indigenous peoples who have been so generous with their stories, revealing both challenges and successes. And a recurring theme through all of these conversations is clearly the importance of building relationships. To show respect for one another, we must surely spend time with one another, and we must learn and listen to each other's stories. Sometimes stories have undeniable darkness. The Friends and Neighbors group, the sponsors of this event, is demonstrating to us that we would be wise to confront all aspects of the past that have tarnished history. And I want to publicly thank the group's members and supporters for their dedication to preserving the Mohawk Institute and to help us think about what reconciliation really means. We must ensure that as many people as possible can learn from the shameful legacy of the residential school system, because only once we acknowledge the past can we work together for a stronger future. And I have reason to believe that we will, because there is a feeling afoot, and I can't quantify it, and it's not based on academic surety of any kind, but there is a feeling afoot that this is a moment in time when people really want to embrace reconciliation. They may not define it the same way, they may not even know how to define it, but there isn't a sector of society, there isn't a geographic place in this province that I've been to where I don't have a feeling that people are looking for ways to do their part in achieving some form of reconciliation. And so that, making reconciliation a reality, is really what gives me hope that that might happen. At this time in history, I am of course convinced of the important role of the Crown in convening diverse people together in dialogue to share those stories. So tonight we're going to hear from Nathan Tidridge. I've heard him speak before, in particular at the Crown in the 21st Century Conference that was held last January in Victoria. Let me assure you that Nathan's genuine concern for reconciliation and the role of the Crown gave all of us much food for thought. Further, I think he has a unique perspective, not only on the past, but where we might go next. He's a persuasive advocate for a more tightly woven relationship between First Nations and the Sovereign, her family, and her representatives. And he continues to make a resolute case for all of us as to how we can work together as we seek reconciliation. So that's enough for me, because it's really him that you came to hear from tonight. I thank the organizers once again for the honor of being here, the privilege of being here at this inaugural lecture. The lecture series is timely and compelling. The lineup of speakers is impressive. And together with thinkers and doers like Mr. Tidridge and others, my hope is that we can all move in the year 2017, our 150th celebration of Confederation, that we can in fact move to a much better country for more of our citizens. So thank you. Merci.
I would like to welcome Nathan Tidridge as our keynote speaker this evening. He teaches at watered-down District High School. He was awarded the Premier's Award for Teaching Excellence and the Charles Bailey Award for Excellence in Secondary School Teaching by Queen's University. As was mentioned, he's the author of several books on the Crown in Canada. His books were launched by the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Over the years, Mr. Tidridge has spoken to numerous groups across the country, including recently the Manitoba Council of Elders and the Crown in the 21st Century Conference held in Victoria. In 2015, he was proud to be appointed to both the Ontario Heritage Trust Board of Directors, the National Advisory Council of the Princess Charities Canada. Earlier this year, Maclean's magazine published his article, Why It's Time to Clearly Define the Crown's Role with First Nations, and this will form the basis of his presentation. Let's give a hearty welcome to Nathan Tidridge.
I don't have any Indigenous ancestry. However, I firmly believe in my treaty relationship with the original peoples of these lands, and that I too am a treaty person. And so it's from that perspective that I speak to you today, this evening. When I was a boy, I spent many summers exploring a lake surrounding my family cottage, Buck Lake, which pours out on either side of the Muskoka-Parry Sound border. It's 20 minutes north of Huntsville, some of you might know it. And it was the source of many adventures that I had as I plied its waters in an old canoe of mine. I buried all the official maps of Buck Lake and its surrounding area, and I opted instead to make my own. And as years went by, I added islands and rivers and new lakes to an expanding world of my own creation. I even discovered a new world, I called it, nearby Fox Lake. And I christened islands with names like Royal Britannia and Royal Avant-Garde, that's a page from one of my journals, and Raymond Island after my grandfather. I even touched off a canoe war with the nearby neighbors. And over time, traditions developed that included flags and medals and great stories and histories told around the campfire. Later, when I attended this institution, Wilfrid Laurier, I published the history of my little world, now called Mainland, in an effort to preserve it indefinitely. I meticulously gathered every piece of information with the help of a remarkable professor, Susan Scott, of the Department of Religion and Culture. And together we created this. We called this my thesis for my undergrad. So Susan and I would meet over tea at her home in Waterloo, and she would gently guide me through the passages and portages of recording personal history. And one day, as we approached what I thought was the end of this process, Susan smiled at me in a way that only Susan could. Her hand covering her tea, wisps of steam coming up from her between her fingers, and she smiled at me and she said, Nathan, how are you going to handle the ideas of imperialism woven into your story? I could feel my canoe grinding up against some unseen rock and water. Susan was merely pointing out the obvious to me. I had not just created my own world, but I had created an empire. I had projected my own identity onto a landscape, the landscape of Buck Lake, and by doing so, I had displaced histories that had been laid down before I arrived. The very idea that other people existed on the lake were building their own worlds, or had built their own worlds, just as personal, just as intimate as mine, had never even occurred to me. So a new book emerged, entitled Beyond Mainland, where I confess in the introduction, I heard other names attached to the islands, rivers and lakes that seemed so familiar to me. I was scared of those names. Their existence implied a loss of control, that I was not the only steward of Buck Lake. I had to learn to relax my grip and expand my view of the land and its history, and accept that many people had traveled these same waters before me. And it was then that I had first encountered the stories of Indigenous peoples on the lake and its surrounding lands. And I learned that my lake was part of a long chain that stretched from Georgian Bay to the eastern hinterlands of modern-day Muskoka. The sleepy hamlet of Ilfracombe had been visited for centuries by the Anishinaabe. I had never imagined Indigenous peoples living on the lands and waters surrounding my cottage. I had always pictured Indians as from some ancient past, far removed from my life. In school, Indigenous people occupied the first few pages of our history textbooks before vanishing into the mists of some linear timeline. And later, when I became a teacher of Canadian history, I was very tentative about exploring First Nations with my students. Resources were very scarce, and the curriculum did not ask us to dwell too long on the subject. Fortunately, that is changing in this province. Indigenous history mystified me. It was filled with names difficult to pronounce and an oral tradition that didn't graft onto my profession's linear approach to history. Added to all of this was a layer of ignorance, manifested by the media and growing up during crises in Oka and Ipperwash, and not to mention the Caledonia land claim that erupted during my second year of teaching. Put simply, for me as a teacher and as a Canadian, it was easier to ignore First Nations than to try and make sense of what had happened between our two peoples. All of that changed the moment I walked into the Mohawk Institute, Canada's first Indian residential school. I had been invited there as a teacher, as a possible excursion for my students. I knew of residential schools, but I didn't know very much about them. And so I took my students there and walked through it. It's the smell that still lingers with me, musty and thick. And as a teacher and as a Canadian, and as a history teacher, I was ashamed and appalled that for the years leading up to that, I had not talked to my students or prepared them properly for that experience. That would never, ever happen again. That has never happened again. I'm proud to say that I have taken my students back to that building every year since then, every semester since then. I'm also a fan of Thomas King. Many years ago, I read his book, The Truth About Stories, and it changed my life. It's a lecture series that he gave as part of the Massey Lecture Series. And there's a passage that I read to my students every single course. And he says, stories are wondrous things, and they're dangerous. The native novelist Leslie Silko, in her book Ceremony, tells how evil came into the world. She says it was witch people, not whites or Indians or blacks or Asians or Hispanics, but witch people. Witch people from all over the world, way back when. And they all came together for a witches' conference in a cave, having a good time. A contest, actually, to see who could come up with the scariest story, the scariest thing. Some of them brewed up potions in pots. Some of them jumped in and out of animal skins. Some of them cast charms and spells. And it must have been fun to watch. Until finally there was only one witch left who hadn't done anything. No one knew where this witch came from or if the witch was male or female. And all this witch had was a story. And unfortunately, the story that this witch told was an awful one, full of fear and slaughter, disease and blood. A story of murderous mischief. And when the telling was done, the other witches quickly agreed that this witch had won the prize. Okay, you win, they said. But what you just said now, it isn't so funny. It doesn't sound so good. We are doing okay without it in our lives. We can get along without that sort of thing. Take it back. Call that story back. But of course, it was too late. For once a story is told, it cannot be called back. Once told, it is loose in the world. I believe Canadians are having such an experience right now regarding their relationships with Indigenous peoples, particularly in light of the truths outlined by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it is a good thing. This country now finds itself tasked with repairing its most ancient relationships. It is in this era of reconciliation that I believe the Crown in Canada is reclaiming one of its foundational roles in our society, because it must be remembered that the monarchy forms the very roots from which the modern state of Canada has grown. Recently, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, recalling over 2 centuries of disruptions to the relationships that had served these lands well since settlers first began arriving, was the following call to action, number 45. We call upon the Government of Canada, on behalf of all Canadians, to jointly develop with Aboriginal peoples a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. The proclamation would be built on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara, of 1764 and reaffirm the nation-to-nation relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. The report goes on to describe this as necessary in establishing what it calls an action-oriented covenant of reconciliation. The original Royal Proclamation, as taught in schools, when it was taught in schools, it's not anymore, was issued in the name of King George III, following the defeat of New France in 1763, and it is often held up as the Indian Magna Carta by the Government of Canada, because near the end, and after much negotiating, it recognized Indigenous nations, placing them under the protection of the Crown. I'm reminded of the words of Justice Murray Sinclair, who said at Rama First Nation, "I love the Royal Proclamation, and I hate the Royal Proclamation." He went on to remind all of us that he didn't need a far-off king to remind him that he existed. The king's representative in this era, or in this area in the 1760s, was a man named Sir William Johnson, an Irishman. And after being reminded of the Indigenous presence on this land by Pontiac, his allies, and other nations, he recognized that a partnership would need to be kindled here, on these lands, on Indigenous terms, using Indigenous diplomacy in order for the Royal Proclamation to be ratified and accepted. The Treaty of Niagara was the end result. The very existence of the covenant chain wampum, which is this right here, presented by Sir William Johnson to the assembled nations, tells us that the settler population once got it, because this belt was created by the king's representative and presented on King George III's behalf. This wampum belt is not an Indigenous artifact. Rather, it is a vice-regal artifact. It is a diplomatic device that was employed by early lieutenant governors of Upper Canada for some time. This belt itself was made by Ken Miracle of Six Nations, of the Cayuga Nation. It took him 40 hours to make, said, but anybody else would take 80 hours. That's what I told him. This last part here, my wife and I and some students who are here now were there when it was completed, and it took him 2 hours, an hour and a half, just to do that last part. And he says, that's because for you, money's important, but for me, it's time. Alan Corbiere of Manitoulin Island read this belt to me. I had the privilege of hearing that. He gave me the short version, and it was 3 hours. So I'm not going to give you the short version. I'm going to give you the short version. At the center of it stands the crown. So here we have the crown, and it's represented by the neck, the head, and a box. Because in our society, people of authority wear, as I tell my kids, blinged out head here, the crown. And here we have an Indigenous person, neck, head, and antlers. Because a lot of the knowledge keepers and leadership in the Seneca Nation, I was told, would have antlers in their headdress. One of which I think is at the Mohawk, or at the Woodland Cultural Center. And they're equals, they're shown as equals. And in between them is the Royal Proclamation. And they're agreeing to it on each other's terms. It forms a relationship that is so strong it's represented by a chain called the silver chain, because silver has to be polished in order to stay bright. Meaning we need to get together and we need to talk this out over and over and over again in order to ensure that the relationship remains strong. We have a date, 1764, which proves again that this is a non-Indigenous artifact, because this is European time. Also, I was told that an Indigenous wampum maker would never represent people this way. But my favorite part of it is here, these unfinished diamonds. Ken Miracle told me that the unfinished diamonds represent nationhood, but the reason that they're unfinished is so that they can be linked together to show Indigenous time. So good. Many Indigenous people, not all, but many, see this as the foundation of Canada and places it 250 years ago. And what an amazing founding document, one that bridges our linear time in reality with Indigenous concepts and time. I think it's just wonderful. It's thanks to Ken Miracle and Alan Corbiere that this belt is now re-entering into the mainstream discourse. When looked at holistically, the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara can properly be seen as one of the many Magna Cartas that continue to live and grow in these lands. The gathering at Niagara extended the great Silver Covenant chain of friendship, originally forged with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy near the east coast into the interior of this continent, bringing with it a familial family relationship with the sovereign. This relationship was supposed to inform future treaties, including the numbered treaties and the modern treaties. It also reinforced that a treaty relationship is a personal one. It's a family connection. We often use the word treaty as a noun in the non-Indigenous community. We have an image of a signed document and a static timeline. I have been told that no, it is a verb, it's an action word, it is a relationship. It's timeless, it's ongoing like any other relationship. And with many, they are with the Queen, regardless of the government or the political developments of the day. Recalling this important relationship, Chief Stacey Laforme of the Mississaugas of the New Credit recently remarked last month, he wrote this, "The Royal Proclamation cannot be properly interpreted unless it is combined with the Treaty of Niagara. And treaties cannot be understood without acknowledging the personal bonds Indigenous peoples have with the Queen and her family." As you know, however, there have been problems. While the Treaty of Niagara was being negotiated, the power of King George the Person was already being curtailed by the emergence of what the English political writer Walter Bagehot called the dignified crown, the Queen and the royal family and her representatives, and the efficient crown, powers that are now exercised by elected ministers, including the Prime Minister and the Premier today. This reality was never articulated in the treaties. Beyond 1764, the gulf between what the Crown was and what the Crown is grew larger in British political life. And the emergence of Canada as a distinct political entity, thanks to Confederation, in 1867, displaced many treaties. In 1931, something called the Statute of Westminster legally created a distinct Canadian crown, albeit with a shared monarch, independent of its British ancestor. So while Elizabeth II ascended the throne in 1952, she did so as the Queen of Canada, not the Queen of Britain. And it was a title formally bestowed on her by the Parliament in Canada the following year. In fact, since the establishment of our first treaty relationships, many non-Indigenous people have repeatedly re-imaged and reimagined the Crown of these lands without consulting or seeking the consent of the nations that are bound with it. I have learned that treaty is a family relationship, and one of the primary members of the family has been dramatically altered without consulting the others. Most Canadians don't realize that for Indigenous peoples, Canada's place in its treaty relationships is not fulfilled by the government of the day, but rather by the Crown, specifically the Queen. As it is, Canadians have a vague understanding of the Crown in Canada, and its place at the very heart of our democracy. We're sitting in the only province that teaches kids civics and government. And reports of the past 2 days, apparently the Ministry of Education has decided to scrap that course. And so the only province that teaches civics will end. So our civic literacy is going to get worse, I think. Indeed, trying to understand the delicate bonds holding this federation together is impossible without encountering our constitutional monarchy. However, what non-Indigenous people need to realize is that the relationship between the sovereign and Indigenous peoples is at the heart of most treaties, if not all. If you remove the Crown from Confederation, our whole family comes apart. If you delete the sovereign from treaties, Canada's very existence becomes impossible. It should not come as a surprise that during a profoundly important royal tour by the Queen in 1973, that a Canadian official, likely Jean Chrétien, was recorded saying to the British High Commissioner that the monarchy and the fact that on occasions the Queen herself can talk directly to Native peoples has helped prevent in Canada anything like a direct confrontation similar to Wounded Knee. To paraphrase Professor Michael Ash at the University of Victoria, Canadians need to revisit the historical narrative they have been told for so long and restore to it the stories that highlight how we lived together on these lands before our relationships were ultimately displaced by Confederation. I believe that true reconciliation demands non-Indigenous Canadians having a better understanding of the intrinsic role that the Crown plays in a democracy, especially concerning treaties. An important point was raised by Professor Douglas Sanders when he observed in 1985. He said, "It's common wisdom that the Queen is powerless." And as a result, advisors have in the past often tried to steer First Nations away from petitions to the Crown. And it's only by ignoring that advice and forwarding their petitions to the King or Queen or their official representatives that Indigenous peoples have actually initiated changes in the Canadian Constitution. Her Majesty and members of the royal family understand, and they continue to honor their unique relationship with Indigenous peoples, and there's numerous examples of this. I would highlight the work of the Prince's Charities in Canada and the tireless efforts by members of the royal family and their representatives, Her Honour included, and especially the Earl and Countess of Wessex. I think they've done a lot of work. Nearby, at the Woodland Cultural Centre, as Chief Hill remarked, a historic event took place on June 21st, Solidarity Day. On that day, Her Honour was joined by the Governor-General for a tour of the Mush Hole, Brantford's former residential school. Afterwards, both representatives of Her Majesty in Canada acknowledged what happened in that school and the legacies that it has left in its wake. And in her address to the assembled dignitaries and members of the public that day, Her Honour said, "One of the greatest privileges I have as Lieutenant Governor is the power to convene. By bringing people together, the institution of the Crown is able to spark new relationships and encourage innovative partnerships. And there is no more important conversation than how we will live together, sustainably and equitably. How can we reimagine a country that is true to its values and strong in its diversity? The official representatives of the Queen provide Canadians with a medium with which they can reconnect with their treaty partners. They are conduits for reconciliation. And there are many examples that highlight the vice-regal representatives of the Queen affirming or even rekindling relationships with Indigenous peoples. On September 14th, after an absence of 142 years, the Governor-General joined with the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan to attend the Treaty 4 Protocol ceremony. Meeting with dignitaries and exchanging gifts, the Governor-General addressed the assembled nation saying, "Treaties, as you know, are living, breathing documents. They are forward-looking. They matter to all of us because they lie at the heart of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And Treaty 4 is fundamental to the relationship between the Crown and the First Nations you represent. Our relationship flows from this treaty, and today we have a chance to strengthen and reinvigorate that relationship." His Excellency then goes on to say, "So what is the role of the Governor-General in this treaty relationship? As I see it, my roles include listening, learning, and celebrating. These are among the reasons I'm here today, to listen, to learn about the spirit and intent of Treaty 4 from your perspective, and to celebrate." He also goes on to say, "Another of my roles is to witness. I believe the Governor-General needs to go a little further. As I outlined in my book, The Queen at the Council Fire, there are specific things that could be enacted by Her Majesty's representatives to further reconciliation that I think would not violate the Convention of Responsible Government that they are bound by in this country. That convention says that they must follow the advice of their elected government. First Nations are independent entities, and they must be treated with a level of respect that only the Crown can offer. And I'd cite the work being done by our sister realm in New Zealand. The Governor-General of New Zealand, that office has been transformed in recent years to reflect its unique position as a bridge between the Maori and non-Indigenous peoples. And there's even a section explaining the relationship between the Queen and Maori on their website. I don't believe such a section exists on any of our current vice-regal websites. During a powerful address at the conference exploring the Crown in Canada held in Victoria that Her Honour mentioned, the Honourable Stephen Point, the first Indigenous Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, stood in the British Columbian legislature where he introduced us to the idea of wordless symbolism. Mr. Point's description of the British Columbian Black Rod, a staff that leads the Queen's representative into the provincial legislature during important occasions, deserves being repeated. He said, "As long as this staff survives and this house stands, Aboriginal people are coming into this house with the sovereign." I was interviewed a few times for the last royal tour of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and everyone kept on saying, "Is it just symbolic?" And my response to that was, I think in our society, we undercut symbolism too much. I think we really need to look at what symbolism means and what it means to the people participating in the event and how that symbolism will be used by people after that event. Like for myself as a teacher, how I would use an event like that to teach about something. At Mr. Point's instigation, during the recent royal tour, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, in the presence of the Governor General and the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, they added a fourth ring to the black rod. It was called the Indigenous Ring of Reconciliation. Now this was a controversial moment in the royal tour, but there is something that I wanted to highlight, because while Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, President of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, did not attend the ceremony, he made sure that there was a representative there, Grand Chief Ed John, to represent them, to explain the moment, the significance of the moment. He said that his reason for not attending was aimed at the elected government. It was not aimed at the crown. And he explained it saying, "The ceremony last night with the Prince and Princess, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and with the Premier of the province, as well as the Governor General and the Lieutenant Governor, was to mark an occasion of reconsidering and renewing the relationship that historically Indigenous people have had with the Crown, and particularly and directly with the royal family. And we have maintained this distinct relationship over the years." And so the event with the Indigenous Ring of Reconciliation was really to underscore that point about the relationship with the royal family, about the relationship with the Crown directly with Indigenous peoples. A unique feature of our constitutional monarchy is that the provincial crowns allow Her Majesty's representatives to adapt to meet the needs of specific regions and nations. The Lieutenant Governors prevent a cookie-cutter solution from being imposed, allowing relationships to reflect the diverse nations that are bound with the Crown across this continent. When people ask about the diversity of Canada and an institution that best reflects the diversity of Canada, I point them to the Crown. If you look at our Governors General and our Lieutenant Governors, you see the real diversity of Canada. We have had 5 Indigenous Lieutenant Governors, and our first was the remarkable Charles Steinhauer, 1974 to 1979. A very learned man, a lawyer, who, as Lieutenant Governor, worked very, very hard to refuse royal assent on a bill that was, would allow the exploration of the Athabasca tar sands. It's a very interesting fact. In this province, of course, we've had the Honourable James K. Bartleman. His Honour, the Honourable Stephen Point, and the Honourable Greg Nicholas in New Brunswick, and the Honourable Yvonne Dumont of the Métis Nation. Ralph Steinhauer also was a residential school survivor. And from his term in office comes this remarkable picture. I put it on the cover of my book. I just love it, because this is one of the supreme constitutional moments for the Crown in Canada. We have the Lieutenant Governor reading the speech from the throne as the direct representative of the sovereign, and he's doing it in his regalia. So physically, he's fusing together the treaty relationship. It manifests itself right there in such a powerful picture. And I really had to dig to find that picture, which shocked me because I thought that this would just be, it's such a wonderful picture. And it comes from 1975. And I don't believe it's ever been replicated by another Indigenous Lieutenant Governor. Protocols and relationships developed by viceregal offices in consultation and with the consent of their Indigenous partners need to transcend individual Lieutenant Governors and Governors General. They have to become embedded in the very heart of our constitutional monarchy. The very wise Rick Hill, the well-respected senior project coordinator from the Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic, he said to me last spring, the treaty roles of the Governor General and the Lieutenant Governors in relation to Indigenous peoples is the single greatest area of consternation. It highlights an identity crisis concerning the role of the Crown. For many vice-regal offices across the country, the incoming official directs what themes will be supported and ceremonies will be attended. In many ways, the dignified Crown resets itself with every appointment. This continual resetting contrasts sharply with the radically different approach to time and history that occurs in Indigenous communities. The lack of institutional memory in regards to Indigenous relationships must be remedied. Maintaining that historic and personal relationship with the Queen and Indigenous peoples must become one of the official, articulated, and publicized duties of the representatives of the Crown in Canada, and should be seen as a key and contemporary responsibility, as important as their duty to always ensure that there's a Prime Minister or a Premier in place. The recent royal tour by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge provides us with a definition to start from. The press release, written by the Government of Canada for the Black Rod ceremony, included a sentence defining the relationship as the historic relationship of the sovereign as the guardian and protector of Aboriginal peoples. I've never seen that written like that before. This definition was slightly reflected in the Duke of Cambridge's address at Haida Gwaii to the Haida Nation, when he said, "The historic link between the Crown and First Nations people is strong, and it is one that I hold dear to my heart." Government houses or offices should become regular gathering places, and in many cases they have, safe spaces for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to come together in community that observe protocols, important protocols, such as receiving petitions, gift giving, sacred fires, feasts, and other ceremonies specific to that nation. I see the grounds of Rideau Hall, as well as the other government houses and vice-regal offices, as the perfect places to create such a physical and permanent space. Manitoba's government house actually gives us a template. Their old government house at Upper Fort Garry, newly restored, provides it's called the Governor's Garden, this circle right here. And it was in that circle where their Lieutenant Governor Morris met with any Indigenous delegation, that arrived in Winnipeg. They were in that garden. And I love that symbolism of a garden at the heart of Turtle Island, the very heart of the continent where Winnipeg is. We are living in a very exciting time right now. There are fundamental changes that are being triggered in these lands. Provincial curricula are being rewritten across the country to incorporate treaty education and Indigenous perspectives in their education systems. In this province, Indigenous perspectives have been woven into nearly every subject. And what this means is that a new generation of Canadians are being raised that will no longer tolerate the status quo. And I see it in my own daughters, an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. The Canada that they know now, they will not tolerate what exists in terms of its relationship with Indigenous peoples going forward. Canadians are beginning to look for ways to re-engage with their treaty partners. With their unique ability to create community, as our honor said today, connect with government, and be seen as above the political fray, the Queen of Canada and her representatives are a way to do that. They have the history and specific relationships needed for such tasks. And to put it simply, they're family. A government restricted by a 4-year election cycle can never hold such a place. Politicians, even with their best intentions, are limited under that scope. As we are learning from the important work from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the residential school program sought to destroy Indigenous languages and replace them with those that included concepts such as seeding, property ownership, and land surrender. And if we see the violence committed through the residential school program through the lens of what our treaty relationships were supposed to be, they become a tax on our own family, and in particular, their children. I would argue that the lack of education around the foundational institutions, such as the Crown in this country, over the past century or so, has contributed to the gulf between non-Indigenous Canadians and First Nations. Part of reconciliation needs to include a re-engagement by Canadians in the mediums that once allowed for communication between our two peoples, and the gathering of diverse community in peace and friendship. Canadians need to have an understanding of how our most fundamental institutions were compromised during the 19th century to allow for this situation to happen. Next year, this country will begin commemorating the 150th anniversary of Confederation. And it's a moment in history that redefined non-Indigenous settlement on these lands. Confederation and the federal and provincial governments it established subsumed and attempted to forcibly replace treaty relationships across this land. Confederation also opened the door to the establishment of the Indian Act. This is one of the definitions included in the Indian Act. And the residential school system that flowed from it. The Indian Act remains the law of the land to this day. This year it turned 140 years old. These are some of the truths that we need to face before reconciliation can begin. And I was thinking again of Thomas King on my drive here, on another passage that he said with this piece about Confederation. I tell these stories not to play on your sympathies, but to suggest how stories can control our lives. For there is a part of me that has never been able to move past these stories, a part of me that will be changed through these stories as long as I live. We need to address these stories. This past summer, my family and I visited beautiful Prince Edward Island, and of course, Reimagine. And during our visit, we watched a short video about Lucy Maud Montgomery, the great author of Anne of Green Gables. And she says, and she's quoted as saying in this video, "It has always seemed to me, ever since early childhood, amid all the commonplaces of life, I was very near to a kingdom of ideal beauty. Between it and me hung only a thin veil. And I could never quite draw it aside. But sometimes a wind fluttered it, and I caught a glimpse of the enchanting realms beyond. Only a glimpse, but those glimpses have always made my life seem worthwhile. I believe we are on a journey to that more perfect kingdom today, and that the crown of this country has the ability to draw that veil aside and help our two peoples connect. It's going to be a long journey. And I don't know if it's going to be this generation that finishes it. In fact, I don't think it will be. It's going to be one that's going to take a long time. But the fact that we're on that journey is the important thing. I'm happy that we are finally polishing the chain together. And I want to end with this image. This is that bell over top of that same canoe that I used to explore those islands. It is now a canoe garden in my home community, planted with soil from the New Credit Reserve, technically illegal under the Indian Act, which is why we did it, to highlight the inequities in our system. And buried in the soil are the names of some of the students that went through the residential school at the Mush Hole, including the father of a colleague of mine who was there with us that day. So I want to thank you for coming and listening today. And I also want to thank our guests, our esteemed guests, for